Let me begin this session by saying we're really honored to have the FDA Commissioner, Rob Califf, with us today and to spend a little time. For those of you who don't know his background, he is an eminent cardiologist who has very broad experience in clinical research and created what I think is probably the largest academic clinical research organization in the world at Duke, a tremendous organization. And now he's running another gigantic, extremely important organization, the FDA, which at the last count I think is 18,000 employees and an annual budget of about $6.5 billion. This is his second time running it, and personally, I'm very pleased that you agreed to do it again. I was thinking that if you gave someone a construction set and said, build a commissioner of the FDA, they would come out with Rob Califf. So it's really great to have you in that position again. Rob, this is supposed to be a fireside chat, so we have to imagine a fireplace here that you and I are relaxing with a brandy snifter or something. You know, I've got a million questions for you, but we have just a half an hour. And if it's okay with you, we'll just jump right in.
Let's do it. Yeah, I apologize for being even out of breath. I mean, New York traffic is back to its old self. And, you know, I literally got here about 30 seconds ago and ran in. I got my sneakers on, so I was able to.
I'm glad you had your sneakers on.
Didn't have time to change shoes.
Great. Terrific. Well, you know, first I'd just like to ask you about your vision for the FDA and what are some of your priorities, and maybe as a sidelight to that, how will changes that you're thinking about influence other regulatory agencies like the EMA?
Well, I'll start there. I mean, Emer Cook, you know, was a friend before. We're pretty good buddies now. We have a lot to talk about, so I think there will be a lot of mutual interdependence. EMA has some significant challenges, you know, related to Brexit, which has had an impact. And, you know, of course, we've got all the different things within FDA, whereas they're just drugs. So we often get into topics where there's the need for cross-collaboration across sectors like devices and drugs, and it's almost impossible at EMA right now. Because you may be aware in devices, they're undergoing this transition to a more rigorous regulatory regime, and it's going to be hard. In terms of my vision, I mean, you know, from my perspective, the FDA is a referee. And if you haven't read Michael Lewis's book on the Fifth Estate or listened to his podcast about referees in America, I would highly recommend that you do that. Both of those sources, I was astounded when I read and listened because it very much reflected what I've been thinking. And I don't know, I'm prone to sports analogies. I've been told not everybody likes sports analogies. I can understand that. But, you know, referees play by a rule book, and I think the FDA is full of people that love to play by the rules. But they do admire it when the players play a good game. It makes a big difference. And it pisses the referees off when the players don't play a good game. And it really pisses referees off when someone cheats. And so those are all very much in play for us. But it's also the case that when it comes to changing the rules, referees have a say. And so I think one of the most important roles of a commissioner is in the places where the referees have a say about what the rules should be, not what the individual calls are. It's like in a game, the referees on the field call the shots. The centers at the FDA and the center directors call the shots. The question of what the rules should be, that's where the commissioner has a big role. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, I think most people know this, but I got a bunch of calls as I was going through confirmation saying that the food side of FDA had been undertended, and that's true. But I was not prepared for quite all the things that have happened that have caused me to become deeply immersed in our food supply issues and FDA's role in that. It's a big part of what I'm spending time on. I think it's one of the most important things to get right now, because if you haven't thought about the impact of climate change, global warfare, faltering international relations, and this thing that happened in America, I blame it on consultants, of course, but just-in-time supply chains with single-source contracting on large scale is a phenomenal way to run a system when everything's working well. But one thing goes wrong, and there is no resilience in the system. And it's also true in drugs and devices, but it has a much bigger impact on food than people realize. Just to give you one number, with infant formula, we've had to use the Defense Production Act 70 times to direct raw materials to go from one commodity into the infant formula supply chain. And it's just a real sign of how much difficulty we've gotten ourselves into in that regard. And then finally, I want to mention tobacco, because I know this is mostly a medical products group. There is no medical product that would save as many lives as we could save if we paid the right attention to tobacco. We're going to lose 500,000 Americans this year. We got 48 million Americans that are using tobacco products. If you add up smoking, cigars, chew, and vaping. Nicotine is very highly addictive. We have a set of laws. We're working through that now, but we don't have much innovation from the industry in helping people stop smoking. And what worries me is if we succeed, I mean, we are determined to succeed in making it really hard for people to stay on tobacco products that are highly addictive and dangerous to them, reducing death and disability. But as we do that, these people are not your average Americans. On average, they're much lower income, much more tendency to live alone, much higher percentage uninsured. Very high proportion of people with serious mental illness are using tobacco products. And sort of like everything else in our healthcare system in the U.S., we seem to pay a lot of money for things that don't matter much and don't pay much for the things that would make the biggest difference. And, you know, ask yourself, how many of our major medical centers are focused on helping people get off of tobacco products? Right. So we're going to do our part, but we need the industry to step up and help and innovate on helping people stop smoking, and we need the health system to do its job.
So you don't think that little label that says the Surgeon General warns you is doing enough?
You got it.
Come up with something better.
Nailed it with that one. You must have gone to Harvard or something.
All right, I'm gonna find a way to needle you as we go on, Rob. So I wanted to ask you about, the last decade has been amazing for new modalities in therapies. So we have living cells as drugs. We're getting close to bugs as drugs, gene editing, mRNA. The list of new modalities is great, and the science is booming. It must be a challenge. It's a challenge for everyone to keep up with the science, but to be in a position to understand it well enough to regulate it must be a real challenge for you and your colleagues in the FDA. And so how do you go about learning about things that have never been on the planet before?
Well, I mean, one big advantage the FDA has in general is that everybody talks to the FDA. Mm-hmm. Despite some consultants that I've run into when I was on the other side of the fence who say avoid the FDA, I think that's a really stupid thing to do, particularly right now.
Right.
It may get you an advantage in the short run. So the FDA is hearing about all this stuff and discussing it. I do think that the pandemic has had an impact on meetings, which are extremely valuable, and it's really critical for people that work at the FDA to get out there and mix it up with people at scientific meetings. I'm actually not particularly concerned about keeping up, as long as we keep the workforce in shape, which is a big issue. Thank you to everybody that worked on the user fees. It's great that we have 5 years of user fees on the medical product side, and that includes some major hiring in areas like gene editing and cell therapy. We're very aware of the role of platforms. Peter Marks is here today. I mean, show me a better use of platforms than the vaccine development thing that's gone on. It's really sort of a model for what can be done. But, in the end, I've always felt like there's a leavening thing that happens at the FDA that I used to enjoy as a clinical investigator. In the end, no matter what your technology is, you got to show that there's a benefit that outweighs the risk in a real live human population. And so we got to keep fine-tuning everything we do to that clinical outcome.
Right. You mentioned just a moment ago the pandemic and COVID, and the agency really rose to the occasion. It was extremely impressive how they helped bring products to the market that were critical without cutting any corners. And I think everybody in this audience admires the agency for what it did. I'm wondering about lessons learned there and in things like oncology and rare disease that you might be able to turn around now and apply to chronic disease to get some of the speed and accuracy that we saw demonstrated with the COVID approvals.
Well, here's where I start. I can't resist. This is where I give my lecture, which you know about. I'll keep it brief. But first of all, let me say, in my view, there's a difference between cutting corners and taking risk. One of the things about the pandemic, and it shocks me that many of the Twitterati, as I call them, don't seem to understand this. If you wait to know everything that you would normally know in medical product development in the midst of a pandemic, everybody will be dead before you've done anything. And so making sure that the inferential basis for what you do is based on something that's accurate and reliable is different than knowing that it's going to work. And I think, you couldn't be in better hands, in my view, than Janet Woodcock, Peter Marks, and Jeff Shuren. And it's made my job a lot easier. They make things happen, and they did when I wasn't there. But they had to take risk, and that means that sometimes it's not going to work out, but they've been pretty darn good, I think, when they do take risk. Now, how does that apply to chronic disease? I know people are tired of hearing me say this. I spent last night with the American Heart Association board. Those are my people, wonderful people. We're going the wrong direction in this country. We got a 5-year shorter life expectancy than the average of other high-income countries. China passed us this year in life expectancy. And a lot of it's COVID. And it's sort of the theme for me. It's hard to argue with the prowess of America in innovation and the development of technology. Our application of technology to human health is awful. I mean, I don't know what metric you want to use. In the league of, as I like to say, in the league of high-income countries, if you follow Ted Lasso, we're in last place. And so we would get relegated to the next league if it worked that way. And so, so we've had a problem with implementation of vaccines and antivirals and other treatments that really work. But we're also going the wrong direction in chronic disease. And so I personally don't think the answer is quite the same as what happened in the pandemic. It's not necessarily taking large amounts of risk. It's more developing a system that integrates the developmental knowledge about interventions with the application that occurs by CMS and the payers. And, you know, we got a great example evolving with Alzheimer's now. You will see if the press release pans out. You know, the companies involved, I have no reason to think they would make up press releases that, you know, it would not be in their interest. So, you know, we're going to have now a good example of a chronic disease affecting millions of people for which there's no good treatment. And we don't really have a way of implementing it or paying for it that I know of. And I think the only way out of this on a rational basis, which is what we did in the pandemic. I mean, remember when Peter Marks and crew said, you're going to have to meet the standard in a clinical trial with a new type of vaccine, and the industry and the clinical community went to work and did it. I mean, it was a very high quality set of clinical trials that were done. I think we need something similar here, except it's in that next phase. It's not will a treatment work, it's how do you actually get the right treatment to the right people. And that is not FDA's lane, right, but we have a role to play in working with the innovator companies to develop a better research plan to produce the evidence that's really needed to get the right answers.
I want to ask you a question. This question is going to be a little bit on the long side, so I'm warning you. But and it's about an opportunity to potentially intervene earlier. Okay. So until recently, if you talked about prevention, the only thing we talked about in America were stop smoking, eat right, exercise, maybe a couple of other things that are broadly applicable to health across the board. But now it seems possible with the way precision medicine is going to take subpopulations of a disease, identify people who are on the road to getting that disease before they actually display it. So they have something that, as you know, in practice, doctors often call pre-disease. And, but to my knowledge, pre-disease is not recognized as a therapeutic target by the FDA, yet you could imagine taking some drugs that are at much lower dose than for treating the disease, or other kinds of intervention to delay or even prevent getting a disease. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about that. Is that an opportunity for the FDA, or is that a bridge too far at this time?
Trying to be diplomatic here, I'd say.
Don't bother.
I see it as an amazing opportunity, and it will be so much fun intellectually to try to figure out how to deal with it. The thing I'm least worried about is technological development. It's on the way. It's going to continue. It's going to get better and better. But I don't agree with the concept that we don't have pre-disease. I mean, basically, if people stopped smoking and we controlled the blood pressure, and we didn't have so much obesity in this country. I mean, remember, obesity is as big a risk factor for cancer as it is for heart disease. And so we know we can identify about half the population with pre-disease now at a pretty high level of certainty that probabilistically they're going to succumb earlier than they should to serious diseases, but we're not doing much about it as it is. Now, refining that with better molecular technologies and remote monitoring for biological signals and all that, I mean, I love it. That's a lot of fun. it's really good. But if we don't develop a system where it's possible to intervene, and if we don't have a system of measurement, because on the one hand, chronic low-level intervention could be wonderful, but it could also harm a lot of people before you even knew it was producing harm. You know, the old saying, it's hard to make an asymptomatic person feel better. And so with most of these things, you're gonna see toxicities that show up well before the potential benefits, and we don't have a regime or a paradigm to deal with that in terms of risk-benefit equation, and we don't have a way to pay for it. And you know, I would hate it if we go down the road we've gone down before, where wealthy people get the benefits of this sort of thing and others don't. But I'm worried that's the direction we're going to end up going.
Again, getting back to COVID and some things that stem from it, of course, the mRNA platforms for vaccines performed fabulously. And one thing that's potentially inherent in using a platform like that is, you know, mRNA for one vaccine, for one agent. You change the sequence a bit, and it's the same molecule with a different sequence, could be applied to another pathogen. And there are categories of things like that emerging. How do you think about, can you look at a class like that and say it's safe if there are only a minimal number of sequence changes, or does each product have to be treated the way a new small molecule is treated, where let's start again and do the whole battery of things that we do?
Yeah, I think the answer is it depends. And I actually have a number of these cases going on now, and you know, Peter just made a major call with this last booster. We'll see if it turns out to be better than the old booster, but even if it's not, I mean, the advantage he had was with the platform, the safety was just not a concern. And if it's not better than the old, it's at least as good. We know that already. So it's a little bit of a safe bet. But we have many other similar situations. Therapeutic antibodies would be another good example related to COVID. But the more complex the platform and the more the variation, the more there are questions that need to be answered before getting the green light. And that's why we need experts at the FDA who are not conflicted but scientifically knowledgeable and not prone to political interference.
Good. You, that was diplomatic. You mentioned kind of your interface with CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And of course, we had an instance where there was FDA approval, but then very limited reimbursement by CMS. And so you had approval of a drug, and then the major payer in the US essentially wasn't going to pay for it. And this was an unusual situation, at least I hadn't seen it before. And I wonder if you could comment on, is that a kind of one-off, or is there a growing kind of collaboration between the FDA and CMS? Where is that going, Rob?
Well, you know, one thing I'm acutely aware of is I think we've had like 6 commissioners in the last 7 years. And so when we talk about a relationship, it's got to be carefully thought about how to forge systems that will stand the test of time. But having said that, just as an American, it's painful for me to see how badly we're doing with our health in this country. And I don't think just inventing new things is a solution, because we're already better at that than any other country. So, you know, the avenue for me is a collaboration with CMS, and we are talking a lot, and we're working on it. By the way, they didn't say they're not going to pay for it. They said we will pay for it, coverage with evidence development.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, it's not FDA's call when that's used.
Right.
But if you ask me as a policy person, I'm very much in favor of that because we're spending $4.1 trillion a year. Can't be that all $4.1 trillion are being well spent. And very often, you know, because of accelerated approvals, we don't really know what the full breadth of the use of a product ought to be or how it compares with other options. So why should we leave that to marketing? I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me when people's lives are at stake. And, you know, 15 years ago when I talked about this, it was like, we're number one and we should do things better. Now we're in last place. You know, we got to wake up and accept that fact and behave differently. And I think a good handoff from FDA to CMS is a critical thing given the proportion of the population that's now covered by Medicare and Medicaid in this country. So I'd love to see us in the later stages of development, sort of the clinical studies that get done are moving into a phase where post-market there's still evidence generation going on. And that, you know, exactly what ought to be done is a matter of, you know, what was done pre-market and what the state of play is out in clinical practice.
At the beginning, we talked about I mean, you've just described a very important interface with CMS. And at the beginning, we talked about another important interface with other regional regulators like the EMA. And you and I have been involved in trying to get harmonization for a long time. It seems like we've been talking about it for at least 3 decades, I guess. And if you look at what happened with the vaccines, for instance, I guess one view might be there was a lot of discussion between the major agencies. On the other hand, from the outside, it looked like, well, there wasn't harmonization. We had the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe, and you know, there wasn't the same list of approvals between the two agencies. So and I'll say one more thing about it is, if ever there was a moment when harmonization should have happened just because of the nature of a pandemic, I'm not sure that it did, but I might not have the right view. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think we're going to be discussing for many years the question of what the right view is about that. I mean, in any circumstance, I think harmonization is probably the wrong term. It's more like federation, because there are very important cultural and economic differences that drive different views on exactly the same data. But in computing now, federation is a big thing, right? And I think when it comes to data, there's no reason why anyone in the world that's regulating shouldn't be able to look at the same data set, same analysis. The findings may mean something entirely different depending on the circumstances of the country. And in a pandemic, I mean, my personal view right now, subject to learning in the midst of it, is you really can't separate economics and politics from medicine in a pandemic. I mean, there are national interests that people had that obviously played in a major way. We could pretend like they're not there, but I don't think that's a wise approach. I think as human beings, we would like them not to be there, but they are. And so I hope as we look back, we'll see things that we could do better. I'd say from the point of view of did the vaccines work, what was the data that was generated, the Federation, I think, worked extremely well. I don't think there were discontinuities between the regulatory groups on that. It exposed some issues, I think, with inspections and when plants are trying to get things up and running with very little lead time. You know, the discussion tends to be about the data, not about all the other things. But all of you that are in the industry, you know how critical the manufacturing part of all this is. And we have different systems of inspections. So stay tuned for a lot of discussion of inspections related to food, but our discussions about food will also have implications for medical products because I think the principles are really the same. And I would hope we get much further along in mutual reliance. So we're not, you know, and people that we trust, we're not having to double check everything. It's just way too expensive. And there's much other place we need to put our attention given the complexity of what we're currently dealing with.
Rob, the logs in our fireplace are burning down. We have time for one more question. So, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the accelerated approval pathways. And some people think that they're not working so well, and others think that they're working well enough, and especially in some important cases, and now's not the time to back off. And of course, you're right in the center of this, and this group would love to hear your thoughts about accelerated approval pathways.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much on the record on this. I'm not in favor of backing off in any way, but I'm also not in favor of having a system where we use unvalidated biomarkers, which is what accelerated approval is. It's the best judgment about reasonably likely by, you know, as I keep saying, an unbiased civil servant who's an expert in the topic. And so they're likely to be right, but reasonably likely is not the same as proven to be true. And I don't think the industry has done a good enough job of the follow-up studies, and I don't think the society has paid enough attention to the quality and design of the studies that would actually answer the questions that are critical. And you're well aware, Michael, that, you know, I want to say thank you again about the user fees, but every 5 years is a chance to fix things that are not right. And because of all the contentiousness, nothing was agreed to that was a fixer. So I think the legislation in play about user fees, I mean about accelerated approval, people ought to look at it. I think, you know, it's going to come up again in the lame duck session. And we just need more clout at FDA to make sure that the bargain is met. That's all. I'm very much in favor of accelerated approval. If there's a disease that's serious without an effective treatment, and there's a plausible story with the right amount of evidence, we ought to, American people have spoken. That's what's wanted, and you know, everyone knows I personally benefited. My mom got a couple of extra years from an accelerated approval drug for a multiple myeloma. And you know, while we're on cloud, the one other thing I want to mention that I think is so important right now, we need more cloud at FDA about supply chains. It's driving me crazy that, you know, supply chains are a trade secret. Okay, and every company has exquisite supply chain information. There is no central repository of supply chains, which means when something goes wrong, whether it's food or drugs or devices, look at what happened with contrast media this year in the United States. It's just not right, and we need to get that fixed. I don't think FDA should be controlling the supply chains, but just like banks, I think we need to be able to do resilience testing. We need to be assured, for example, that companies are not putting 100% of their supply in a country which is has a policy that's almost, adversarial to us. American people need assurance that the composite of the supply chains will produce access to necessary products despite these stresses that we're under. But for whatever reason, the industry keeps lobbying to stop it when we try to get those authorities. So it's something I think people don't realize how bad it could get. If that rail strike had happened, I think people would have seen a lot of things that are not good.
Right. Rob, I know I'm right that you're the right person for this job, and I just want you to know people not only appreciate your taking time out to come here, but the candor with which you've fielded these questions. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I think you know this, but I don't know, I have a gene for not being able to hold back on what I think, but when the president called, I figured at my age, I'm not looking for the next job, so I ought to just give it a shot for what I think ought to be done. And I welcome argument. I think a lot of what's going on now, there's a lot at stake for the industry and for this country. It could be an amazing time. All the biotech that you're working on for drugs, and I mean, it is nothing in my view compared to what biotech can do for food at this point, for the global population with climate change, et cetera, upon us. So, let's have the arguments and work to a better system. So
are you the only person who's been FDA commissioner twice?
Apparently, I heard last night someone did extensive research, and 100 years ago. Is that possible? There was some person that did it twice.
You'll just have to try for 3.
I think I'm the only one that's been Senate confirmed twice, which I would not recommend for anybody.
Thank you so much. That was great. We really appreciate it.